There was a crowd following him. Everywhere Jesus went, there was a crowd following him. We hear this in Mark's gospel, starting at the very first chapter. From the synagogue at Capernaum, where Jesus first heals a man with a troubled spirit, to the house of Simon's mother-in-law, where by sundown of that very same day, we're told the whole city was gathered around the door. Jesus makes his way around the towns of the Sea of Galilee, healing the sick and casting out demons. By chapter 3, the crowd has gotten so big that Jesus tells his disciples to have a boat ready for him so that the crowd wouldn't crush him. And even when he tries to get away from the crowd by crossing to the other side of the sea, other boats follow. And even when it's just him and his disciples in the boat, they manage to crowd him, waking him up from his nap to calm a storm. Everywhere he went, there was a crowd. I wonder what it was like being in those crowds around Jesus. Was it exhilarating, like cheering for the home team at some big sporting event? Was it anxiety-provoking, like squeezing into a packed subway car at rush hour just as the doors are closing? Was it even a little frightening, like a hungry crowd where relief supplies are being distributed, people pressing in from all sides, reaching and flailing and jostling? The curious part of me might be drawn to getting a glimpse of this great teacher, but the claustrophobic part of me would want to run in the opposite direction. Now, in the passage we heard today in chapter 5, Jesus goes ashore and is immediately met by a great crowd. We hear of two individuals who managed to attract his attention. The first is named Jairus, who throws himself to the ground in front of Jesus, begging him to heal his young daughter who is dying. Now, Jairus is a man of social standing, respected in his community. He's a synagogue leader. Yet, desperation from his child's illness has lowered him to the ground. Jesus is moved by his plight. But as he sets off on the road to one work of mercy, his mission is interrupted by someone else in need, someone at the margins of society on several counts. First, she is a woman. That alone made her a lesser person in the society of the ancient Near East, where women did not make decisions or own property or anything of the sort. They were passed from their father's possession into their husbands. In this story, the woman is nameless. Second, she's sick. She's been suffering from a condition that must have left her physically depleted and anemic, not to mention emotionally exhausted from the futility of approaching one healer after another to no avail. And third, she's an outcast. Given the nature of her illness, that is, involving blood, she would have been seen as ritually unclean. Ritual impurity was understood as contagious. If someone is ritually unclean, then whoever or whatever comes into contact with that person also becomes unclean. Her approach to Jesus is at once indirect and direct. Indirect in that she sneaks up behind him. After 12 long years of illness and isolation, perhaps she was just so used to being set apart, to being alone in the crowd, that it wouldn't even occur to her to step in front of him. At the same time, her mere proximity to Jesus is, in fact, direct and assertive. Just by being in a crowd and by daring to draw close to him, she would have been endangering not only his purity, but also the purity of the others who came into contact with him. Had the disciples seen her approaching Jesus, surely they would have tried to block her path. I wonder what I would have done had I been there in that crowd. Would I have stepped around her and pretended I didn't see her? Would I have politely nudged past her so I could get a better look at Jesus? Would I have stopped and looked her in the eye and made room for her? Somehow, in spite of or with the help of the crowd, the woman manages to reach out and to touch the fringe of Jesus' cloak. He feels the power go forth from him, and she's healed instantly. We could guess that physical healing would have been enough for her, but it wasn't enough for Jesus. To her surprise, he stops in his tracks and turns away from the synagogue leader and asks who it was who had touched his clothes. His disciples are incredulous. How could he possibly know that someone had touched his cloak? But Jesus looks all around, searching for her face in the crowd. She falls down before him and tells him the truth. And Jesus acknowledges her publicly with honor, with kindness, with respect. He says, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Be healed. Go in peace." For Jesus, healing isn't simply waving a magic wand or transmitting a current of energy. It's about relationship. He couldn't walk away until he had seen her face to face and spoken with her. For Jesus, the most important thing was to encounter her as a human being. And he heals her not only of her physical suffering, but also of her emotional and spiritual suffering. He restores her dignity in the eyes of her community. In this encounter, like so many others we hear about in the Gospels, Jesus reaches out to restore wholeness to someone whom the world has rejected as unworthy. Again and again in the Gospels, Jesus delights in reversing expected roles, rich and poor, worthy and unworthy, powerful and powerless. Again and again, he affirms the inherent goodness of every human being. And he does this somehow under the constant pressure of those crowds. Somehow, we're told, he manages to pause, to notice, and to create a space for deep and meaningful encounter with someone. Now, during this delay, the synagogue leader gets the news that his daughter is already dead. But Jesus speaks quietly to Jairus and reassures him and says, "Don't be afraid." When they arrive at his home, they find a crowd of mourners wailing aloud. And Jesus says to them, "Why do you make such a commotion? The child is just sleeping." And the crowd, they laughed at him. Jesus responds by sending them away. Then he goes in to see her. He takes her by the hand and says, "Little girl, get up." And she does. She gets up immediately and walks around. Everyone is overcome with amazement. When we read this text, we might just gloss right over the role of the crowd. But it's precisely here, from the role of the bystander, that we find ourselves drawn into the question of faith and healing. If we had been there in that crowd, would we have laughed too? Would we have been curious, skeptical, overcome with amazement, or maybe even a little disappointed? The truth is, Jesus, in reaching out to some, didn't make it to some others. What about those others who cried for help but were not healed, even when they did pray and believe and trust in God? Here we are today, our own little crowd, learning to follow Jesus. And in the crowdedness of our busy, busy lives, we have carved out this time together. Some of us hold powerful testimonies of healing that we've seen or known of. Some of us bear the grief and sorrow of prayers that seem to have gone unanswered. Some of us carry deep pleas for healing for someone precious to us right now. And I imagine that most of us know something of all of these realities. And I pray that through our being here together, we might feel a little less alone in whatever we're carrying, and a little more connected with a great cloud of witnesses who have gone before us, and this great crowd of companions who walk alongside us, each of us and all of us, called to seek the compassion of Jesus and to share it through our seeing and being seen, through word and action, in the breaking of bread and in the prayers. Thanks be to God.